It was like a reversal of what happened at Pearl Harbor. This time, we brought the destruction to their fleet. On the morning of February 17, 1944, as the sun rose, we caught the Japanese completely off guard. Our dive bombers descended rapidly through the warm skies over Truk Lagoon. Below us was Japan's most prized naval stronghold in the Pacific. So heavily packed with enemy vessels that I had never seen anything like it. I was Lieutenant Commander Robert Steele Henderson, piloting an SPD Dauntless with Bombing Squadron 10 from the USS Enterprise. And I was about to witness the most significant loss of enemy ships in a two-day battle. What we achieved over the next 48 hours would break Japan's naval strength in the Central Pacific and turn their key base into a sunken graveyard. My account begins 3 days earlier, on February 14th, aboard the Enterprise as our task force moved westward across the Marshall Islands. Admiral Mark Mitcher had put together the mightiest carrier force ever seen. There were 12 swift carriers grouped into 4 separate units, carrying over 650 planes and shielded by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Our objective was clear and daring, to strike and neutralize the Japanese naval installation at Truk Atoll, eliminating it as a threat to our campaign across the Pacific. Truk wasn't just any installation. Since capturing it from the Germans in World War I, the Japanese had built it up as a massive coral fortress, located in the Caroline Islands, about 1,500 miles southeast of Guam. Truk Lagoon was surrounded by a protective ring of islands and held a deep lagoon that could harbor an entire navy. The Japanese had set up runways, fuel stations, repair docks, and anchorages for their combined fleet. Intelligence suggested more than 60 vessels were stationed there, guarded by over 40 fighter planes and numerous anti-aircraft defenses. To them, it was an unsinkable aircraft carrier. To us, it was a prime target. At 5 a.m. on February 17th, I was in the ready room aboard the Enterprise, reviewing reconnaissance images with my squadron. The photos showed the lagoon filled with warships, cargo carriers, submarines, and tankers. Looks like a naval convention, joked Lieutenant Tommy Rodriguez, my wingman. Our squadron leader, Lieutenant Commander Jesus, pointed out key targets on the images. He explained that intelligence had counted at least 50 major ships. The focus was on disabling warships and aircraft, with fuel and repair areas as secondary objectives. Truk had served as the Japanese central supply point across the Pacific, but we were about to change that. At 6:30, the alarm echoed through the ship, calling all pilots to action. This wasn't a training run. I grabbed my gear and moved quickly to the flight deck. The Enterprise was already launching Fighters 18 Hellcats under Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, tasked with sweeping the skies of any enemy planes. I climbed into my Dauntless while my rear gunner, aviation radioman, second class Mike Sullivan, was checking his twin .30 caliber guns. Ready to stir up some trouble, Sully? I asked. Been ready since Pearl, he replied, as the carrier turned into the wind and gained speed for launch. Other ships in our task force began sending up their own aircraft. Within 2 hours, over 400 American planes were flying toward Truk in what would become the largest naval airstrike to date. At 7 a.m., I got the green light to take off. I advanced the throttle, rolled down the deck, and rose into the early light. Tommy joined me on the right wing, followed by the rest of Bombing Squadron 10-12 dive bombers, each armed with a 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb. Our target was a heavy cruiser moored near the heart of the fleet. As we climbed, I got a full view of Truk Lagoon. It was even more daunting than the photos had shown. A circle of emerald green islands enclosing a deep blue harbor filled with ships. I counted at least 40 large vessels in one glance, with others spread out in smaller anchorages. They've got enough to form a whole navy. Tommy radioed. That's what they think, I said, but we're here to stop that. We knew we had the upper hand when we saw enemy planes still sitting idle on the runways. Our fighters had caught them completely unprepared. Below, Hellcats were sweeping in low, tearing up the airstrips and destroying planes before they could take off. Fires and explosions erupted across the base as the enemy's air force was picked apart plane by plane, but they weren't entirely unarmed. As we neared the harbor, anti-aircraft fire began climbing toward us. First the bursts of flak, then glowing tracer rounds from automatic guns. The Japanese had fortified the anchorage well and were now filling the sky with gunfire. Flak ahead, I called. Stick together and follow me in. I pushed my Dauntless into a steep dive. This aircraft had been built for moments like this, steady and accurate. As I aimed for the heavy cruiser, I could see enemy sailors scrambling to man their guns. Red tracers zipped past the cockpit, but I held course, watching the ship grow larger in my bomb sight. At 2,500 feet, I released the bomb and pulled sharply up, the aircraft shaking as it climbed. Behind me, Sully opened fire on the ship's structure, his bullets cutting through the chaos. Looking back, I saw my bomb hit near the center of the cruiser, erupting in a huge blast that sent smoke and debris into the air. Right in the engine room, Sully shouted, Moments later, Tommy's bomb struck the forward part of the ship, triggering an even larger explosion that tore through the bow. The cruiser began to tip to the side, already beyond saving. Similar scenes were happening all over. American dive bombers and torpedo planes were systematically attacking the Japanese fleet. I saw a group of Avengers drop torpedoes toward a line of destroyers. Several explosions followed as the torpedoes hit. The light cruiser Katori tried to escape the harbor, but SBDs from the Yorktown intercepted her, dropping 4 bombs in quick succession. The blasts ripped apart her upper decks, and she sank rapidly, taking most of her crew with her. One of the most devastating hits came when a tanker near the fuel depot was struck. An Avenger's torpedo ripped through the hull, spilling aviation fuel into the water. When it ignited, fire spread quickly from one vessel to the next, creating a wall of flames. The blaze engulfed the harbor, and thick smoke rose high into the sky visible from 50 miles away. By 9:30, the first attack wave was done, and we regrouped to head back to the carriers. As I ascended away from Truk, I glanced down at the destruction we had unleashed in just 2 hours. The lagoon had become a nightmarish scene, ships ablaze, thick plumes of smoke curling skyward, and dark streaks of oil spreading over the surface. At least 20 large vessels were either sinking or had already gone under, with others still engulfed in flames. But this was just the beginning. As we headed back to the Enterprise to refuel and rearm, another group of bombers was already lifting off. Admiral Mitcher had designed this mission to be relentless. Aircraft would be launched in continuous waves until the Japanese naval forces in the Central Pacific were completely eliminated. After landing and reloading, I was airborne once more. By late morning, carrying a fresh payload, our next target was a group of destroyers anchored near the northeastern part of the lagoon. Intelligence had reported 6 or more enemy ships in that area. This strike turned out to be even more devastating than the first. With most of the Japanese anti-aircraft positions silenced earlier that day, we had far more room to operate. My squadron landed 3 direct hits on the destroyer Macus, splitting it apart in a massive explosion that flung wreckage across a wide stretch of water. Another destroyer, the Fumizuki, was torn open when Tommy's bomb detonated her forward munitions, producing a similar catastrophic result. What struck me most was how thorough and overwhelming the destruction was becoming. This wasn't a traditional sea battle, it was more like a firing range. With their vessels sitting still and unable to maneuver, the Japanese had no real defense. Against our coordinated air assault, we moved from one target to the next, sinking each ship with precision. Next on our list was the massive submarine tender Inaru, which stretched over 500 feet and was docked near the main sub-base with several smaller boats tied alongside. As my squadron began its descent for a bombing run, a group of Avengers from the Bunker Hill launched torpedoes at her. The timing was perfect. Torpedoes slammed into her port side just as our bombs struck from above. The resulting chain of explosions was so powerful it sent shockwaves across the entire lagoon. By midday, the Japanese were desperately trying to escape. Some ships made a dash for open ocean, hoping to avoid further damage. But U.S. submarines waited outside the reef, and our surface vessels had moved into position to block any retreat. One destroyer nearly got away but was torn apart by a full barrage from the USS Iowa, just beyond the lagoon's edge. As the afternoon progressed, the assault on the Japanese fleet grew even more intense. The light cruiser Naka tried to flee with a convoy of supply ships but was intercepted by 3 coordinated bomber groups. I watched as she absorbed strike after strike bombs, rockets, and torpedoes until she finally capsized and sank in the channel, blocking it for others trying to escape. What stood out most that afternoon was how organized and deliberate the attacks became. With enemy defenses mostly gone, we could take our time. Each strike was carefully planned to maximize destruction. It no longer felt like combat, it felt like a dismantling operation. We were taking apart the Japanese naval base piece by piece. Our next mission focused on their fuel depots. Vast storage areas holding millions of gallons of gasoline, oil, and lubricants, essential resources for sustaining Japanese operations in the region. Fighter planes equipped with incendiary rounds ignited the complex, turning it into a firestorm. When the aviation gas reserves went up, the explosion was so intense it could be felt on our carriers 40 miles away. Amid the widespread devastation, individual acts of bravery stood out. I saw Lieutenant Commander John Phillips lead his torpedo squadron through a wall of gunfire to sink the cargo ship Iko Kumaro. Later intelligence revealed it was carrying aircraft engines and spare parts for Japanese airfields across the Pacific. Destroying that vessel likely crippled their air operations for months. By late afternoon, the lagoon resembled a giant graveyard. Flames rose from broken ships. Smoke spiraled thousands of feet into the air, and the once clear water was blackened by oil and floating wreckage. Intelligence teams would later confirm that over 30 major enemy vessels were sunk or destroyed in just the first day of attacks. But Admiral Mitcher wasn't finished. As the sky darkened, he gave the green light for an unprecedented move. In naval aviation and nighttime carrier strike, it was the first time in history that American carriers launched a major attack after dark. The opportunity was too critical to pass up. At 10 p.m., I was airborne once more, heading toward a lagoon. Still glowing from fires said earlier, flying at night was strange and tense, guided only by the flickering light of burning ships and distant explosions. But it worked. Japanese crews still struggling to save damaged ships had no warning when our aircraft arrived. One transport, the Shinko Kumaro, was trying to run aground to avoid sinking. But our night attack found her first. A single bomb landed in the middle of the ship, breaking her apart and sending her to the bottom. Nearby, the tanker Hoyomaru, which had been aflame since morning, was finally finished off by a torpedo from a night-flying Avenger. She sank in the center of the harbor. When morning came on February 18th, fresh waves of U.S. aircraft returned, bringing even more losses for the enemy. By this point, any coordinated defense had completely collapsed. Anti-aircraft fire was scattered and ineffective. Most Japanese fighters had either been destroyed the day before or were shot down early in the fighting. The remaining ships had little to protect them. One of the most dramatic moments came when the ammunition ship Kokumaro, already ablaze from previous torpedo strikes, finally reached her central magazine. The resulting explosion sent a towering column of fire and smoke into the sky, rising over a mile high and blasting debris across the lagoon. The shock wave was strong enough to break windows on ships 10 miles away and was felt aboard our carriers far out to sea. What followed was a systematic removal of anything that could float. Cargo ships, auxiliary vessels, submarines, and small boats, none were spared. The Sankasan Maru took 5 direct hits and sank on the spot. The huge subtender Heian Maru was blown apart in a coordinated assault from several squadrons. The Japanese were now in survival mode, scrambling to evacuate personnel and supplies to the surrounding islands, using whatever small boats they had left. But even those were hunted down. American fighters strafed anything that moved on the water. One badly damaged destroyer, the Takikaze, attempted a last-ditch escape but was hit just beyond the reef and sank with no survivors. Adding to the already staggering toll, by the afternoon of February 8th, the Wind's mighty naval base at Truk Lagoon had been reduced to a landscape of devastation. Oil coated the surface of the water, scattered wreckage drifted everywhere, and the skeletal remains of destroyed ships jutted from the depths. Fires still smoldered on nearby islands where fuel depots had been struck. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning fuel and explosives. Our final missions focused on wiping out the last remaining facilities, docks, workshops, command centers, and anything that could still serve a military purpose. The aim was clear, to cripple Truk so thoroughly that rebuilding it into a functioning base would take an enormous amount of time and effort. As our fleet pulled away from Truk that evening, the scale of the damage we had inflicted became more apparent. Reports from intelligence indicated that over 50 Japanese vessels had been destroyed, including several warships. More than 250 enemy aircraft had been lost. Most of them never even got off the ground. Japanese casualties numbered in the thousands, with more than 4,500 either killed, wounded, or unaccounted for. Over 17,000 tons of aviation, fuel, and oil had been obliterated. On the American side, the cost was remarkably low, just 17 planes and 35 airmen lost over the course of 2 days. It stood as one of the most one-sided victories in the history of aerial naval warfare, with an advantage ratio exceeding 15 to 1. However, the importance of this operation reached far beyond the immediate tactical win. With Truk in ruins, Japan lost its main stronghold in the Central Pacific. They were forced to fall back and concentrate on defending their home territory. The psychological blow was equally powerful. If we could reduce Truk, once thought to be impenetrable, to ashes, then no Japanese base was truly secure. Even more significantly, the operation proved what a well-coordinated fast carrier force could accomplish. Our fleet had traveled over 1,500 miles from its home ports, launched more than 1,200 combat missions in just 2 days, and wiped out an entire naval hub. It was a sign of what American naval air power could do as we pressed closer to Japan's doorstep over the coming year and a half. For Japan's Navy, Truk marked a turning point from which they would never fully recover. The warships lost made up a large part of their remaining fleet. Among the aircraft destroyed were many flown by seasoned pilots, veterans who had been in the fight since the attack on Pearl Harbor and who could not easily be replaced. The fuel and resources destroyed at Truk were meant to support the defense of the Mariana Islands, which would soon become our next target. As I flew back to the Enterprise that final night, I glanced over my shoulder at the smoke still rising from the shattered base. I knew I had been part of something unprecedented, a concentrated 2-day campaign that had annihilated an enemy naval force. What Japan had taken years to build, we had dismantled in less than 48 hours. Still, no one on our ship celebrated. That evening, we understood that this was just another chapter in a long and costly war. The enemy would fall back, regroup, and prepare new lines of defense. More battles lay ahead. more lives would be lost. Truk was a major victory, but it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the final phase of the Pacific Campaign. The men who fought and died at Truk, whether American or Japanese, believed in what they were fighting for. Japanese sailors and pilots defended their homeland, their leaders, and their traditions. We Americans were there for liberty, for the right of people to live free and shape their own futures. Both sides fought with resolve. Both suffered deeply. What made this battle stand out was not just the scale of destruction, it was how precise and advanced American naval aviation had become. 2.5 years after Pearl Harbor, our forces had developed the skill, tools, and organization that made them nearly unstoppable in the skies. Our training was more refined, our aircraft more advanced, and our supply lines better managed. The Japanese, though determined, couldn't keep pace. They were stretched thin, with limited reinforcements and inferior equipment. Even today, the submerged remains in Truk Lagoon serve as a silent reminder of that turning point. Divers who explore the wrecks still find visible signs of the bombardment, gaping holes torn by bombs, shattered holes from torpedoes, twisted steel frozen in place since 1944. But for those of us who flew those missions, who braved the enemy fire over that island ring, the real legacy is in knowing we helped shift the course of the war in the Pacific. We took what had been Japan's strongest outpost and left it a cemetery. We proved American forces could reach anywhere and hit with overwhelming force. And we sent a message back to Japan that the war they had started in Hawaii was coming full circle. Operation Hailstone wasn't just retaliation for Pearl Harbor. It was a display of the strength we had built and the progress we had made. The flames that engulfed Truk were the final blow to Japan's naval dominance in the Pacific. From that moment on, the end of the war was no longer in question. The young aviators who flew those missions went on to fight in the Philippines, at Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Many did not return, but all of them played a part in the relentless advance across the Pacific that would finally lead to Japan's surrender aboard the USS Missouri. Looking back now, decades later, I'm struck by how young we were, boys really thrown into the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen, and expected to achieve impossible things with limited tools and minimal preparation. Yet we managed, we adapted, and in the end, we succeeded. What happened at Truk showed the world that a free and determined people, when properly mobilized, could overcome any challenge. The wrecks lying beneath the waters of that lagoon are symbols of both our victory and the bravery of those we fought. They remind us that war, no matter how justified, always comes with an awful price. The men who died there on both sides deserved more time, more life. But they also deserve to be honored for their courage, their sacrifice, and their role in shaping the future of freedom in the Pacific. In the end, the battle for Truk Lagoon wasn't just a military triumph. It was a defining moment in the Pacific War. It proved that the tide had turned, that the forces of freedom were advancing. With unstoppable resolve, the wreckage left beneath those waters tells a powerful story, not only of destruction, but of courage, sacrifice, and the price of war. For those who fought there, it was a moment etched in memory. For history, it marked the beginning of the end for Japan's naval power in the Pacific. Truk Lagoon stands today not just as a battlefield, but as a silent memorial, one that reminds us of the lives lost, the lessons learned, and the enduring strength of those who fought to shape a better world.